Jesus told us that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. Yet, over the past 2 years, as we've watched the events in Gaza unfold, something deeply troubling was revealed. Millions of people who claim to be Christian have forgotten that last part, to love the Lord your God with your mind. So I want to walk through the main talking points that I've heard people who claim Christ accept and even use to justify the horrors in Gaza. Hi, I'm Vanessa. Welcome to Wholeheartedness and my mini-series, What Gaza's Revealed. Some of the things we as Christians should fight to never be guilty of is having double standards, being hypocritical, and showing partiality. But when we become mentally lazy, when we don't think things through and we blindly accept what we're told, and when we fail to view the world through a biblical lens, we will become guilty of all of those things. But let's run through some of the main talking points that people have accepted who claim to be Christian. Let's start with the most infamous one of all. Hamas uses human shields. Accepting this talking point violates multiple biblical principles, and it's honestly just silly and exposes hypocrisy. I first want to be clear that if Hamas uses human shields, if and whenever they do that, I agree 100%. We condemn it and we oppose it. But the thing is if Hamas is guilty of using human shields, then modern Israel, by its own definition, is also guilty of using human shields, and on a far greater scale. Not only is there video and photo evidence of the IOF using Palestinian civilians as human shields, but by their own definition, modern Israel is using Israelis as human shields too. Do you know where one of modern Israel's main military compounds is? It's located in central Tel Aviv. Yeah, one of the most densely populated civilian places in their country. They have a military compound. And guess what else? Part of that military compound is underneath Tel Aviv. That's pretty ironic. And while I've never been to modern Israel, I know people who have, and they say that modern Israel has armed military personnel on nearly every single corner of their entire country. By their own definition, they've embedded their armed militants in civilian populations. Is that not the exact definition of human shields? It's just a wicked double standard, and it just reveals what James 2:9 strongly warns against: partiality. Because if any nation surrounding modern Israel were to do to modern Israel what it's done to Gaza, none of these people would be using the excuse of human shields. They would be demanding justice. They would be demanding that it ends. So in them accepting this excuse, they expose their own hypocrisy. And what also disturbs me about people who claim Christ and accept this very godless and mindless excuse is that they use it to portray modern Israel as if they're some kind of victim, like they've been forced against their will and like they had no other choice but to kill civilians, break international laws, starve an entire population, target children with snipers, to bomb civilians in places they promised them safety, and like they have just been forced to do terrorist things. It's a distortion of reality that goes to such great lengths to really just pervert justice and to give a false testimony about modern Israel's responsibility for their crimes. And last thing, this is just honestly a disgusting excuse, because at the core, it's essentially making the claim that when someone is used as a human shield against their will, that it strips them of their right to life and protection. Because the people who have accepted this mindlessness for Gaza would never accept this excuse if their family member or their own life were caught up in such a situation. The excuse of human shields would never be accepted by these people if it were to happen in America and a hospital were bombed or an apartment complex was leveled with everybody inside. For the Christian, we should hate the shedding of innocent blood, and we should despise and condemn those who do it, because God does. That's why we love movies and real-life heroes who go to great lengths to preserve innocent life. It's honorable, good, biblical, and just. But collectively punishing the innocent 99.9% of a civilian population in order to get to the guilty 0.1% of the population, that is not heroic. That is nothing to be sympathized with. It's evil. Supporting this dangerous idea of essentially collective punishment violates what we learn in Ezekiel and Deuteronomy, that you do not punish the innocent for the sins of others. It doesn't matter if it's their father. It doesn't matter if it's their spouse. You do not hold the innocent accountable for the sins of others. And then the second excuse, well, they elected Hamas. People were saying this to justify the collective punishment taking place in Gaza because after all, they elected these people, so therefore I guess they're all collectively responsible for anything Hamas does. But not only is this a disgusting approval of collective punishment, but it also reveals these people's ignorance to the facts and the demographics of Gaza, because half of Gaza is 18 years old and younger. And Hamas was elected in 2005, so 20 years ago, and there hasn't been any elections since. So that means most people today who live in Gaza were not even alive when Hamas was elected, or they just weren't old enough to vote. This sets another dangerous and really demonic precedent because these people are essentially supporting the idea that people's opinions make them worthy of death. Yet the stunning irony, after using this excuse for 2 years, many of those same people were outraged when Charlie Kirk was murdered for his political and personal views. And last thing with this one is these people are clearly ignorant to the facts, or they're just totally trying to ignore them. Because modern Israel's leadership, so Netanyahu and other PMs, they wanted Hamas to take power because they wanted to avoid peace. They meddled in Gaza's elections to ensure the likes of Hamas made it into power. Not to mention again that Netanyahu was funneling millions of dollars to Hamas after they took office. That sounds pretty supportive to me. And you know those charges against Netanyahu that Donald Trump has been begging Israelis to drop? Yeah, that's what it's all about. Boy, do we live in a crazy, topsy-turvy world. Now, what about this claim that we hear most often? Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, of course, I agree that any innocent person has the right to defend themselves, but mass murdering civilians, bombing nearly every hospital, using starvation as a weapon of war, withholding baby formula and high-protein foods from children that they have starved and malnourished, preventing people that they have injured from leaving Gaza to receive life-saving care and instead leaving them to die from treatable injuries, that's not self-defense. That's collective punishment and the textbook definition of terrorism. But I'll let Netanyahu explain that one for you.
Because what terrorists do is target the innocent deliberately. And therefore my definition of terrorism is the systematic and deliberate attack, the murder, maiming, and menacing of innocents, of civilians, for political goals.
And then there's the release the hostages. Thankfully, at this point, all of the living hostages have been released. But people even make the claims that if Hamas had just released the hostages, that this would have been over a long time ago. But one, all the hostages, except for the deceased ones, are now back in modern Israel. And yet, what is still happening to this day? There has been over 125 violations of the ceasefire by modern Israel. Hundreds of people have been murdered by bombs by modern Israel. Not really much of a ceasefire, and doesn't really seem like modern Israel intends to stop. To me, it seems like, hostages or not, modern Israel is looking for every opportunity to murder Palestinians. And what people haven't realized when they say this excuse, that they're really revealing something that's terrifying once again about themselves. Because essentially the line of logic that these people were using is as long as Hamas has Israeli hostages, mass murder, collective punishment using starvation as a weapon of war, it's all justified, which further proves that they don't see the world in a biblical way, because that shows that they don't value human life equally, though ironically many of them claim to be pro-life. But as we know, the Bible is very clear that all human life is valuable equally, not one more than the other, because every single human is made in the image of God. And then there's the excuse that there is no such thing as Palestine. Find it for me on the map, they would say. And there's no such thing as a Palestinian. To me, I honestly just don't get this one. This one is like beyond mindless. Because regardless if you want to call them Palestinian or not, regardless what you think about the legitimacy of the state of Palestine, it's really irrelevant. Because they're human beings. They are real. They're not just a fictitious, just because you don't believe that the word Palestinian or that the country Palestine exists doesn't make them as people fictitious and not real. And do they so quickly forget that Less than 80 years ago, there was no such thing as an Israeli. There was no such thing as the modern state of Israel. Does that mean that the Jews who lived there, who eventually became Israelis, that they had no right to freedom or safety? No, because for the Christian, living in a recognized nation and identifying descriptors are not what gives a life value. Once again, it's being made in the image of God that gives every single human being value. And a true Christian would never make a human's life, their worth, and their value dependent on such silly and temporary things. And the last claim that really, really irks my nerves is that this is a Muslim versus Jewish conflict. It's a religious conflict. But that's a lie that distracts from the real issue, which the true issue is injustice. This is not really a religious conflict at all, because the historical fact is Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived peacefully in the land together prior to the 1948 establishment of the modern state of Israel. For centuries, they lived harmoniously with one another, and there are people alive today who descend from the Jews and the Christians and Muslims who lived there, who all testify the same. They were friends. They lived in community with one another. There was no hostilities. So the facts are clear. The unrest began and has been fueled and sustained by the unchecked injustices being imposed on the surrounding population by modern Israel. I think the single thing that destroys this idea most is the fact that there are tens of thousands of Palestinian Christians who live in Palestine in modern Israel. And the ones who live in Palestine are resisting their oppression under modern Israel alongside their Muslim neighbors and family. So Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims are both victims to modern Israel's oppression. So making this a Jews versus Muslims conflict erases the tens of thousands of Palestinian Christians who are there. And I truly believe it's a lie that's been spread to cause us to overlook the true root and the true cause of this issue. And therefore, it avoids the true solution, which is modern Israel ending their apartheid state and their illegal occupation. When Christians mindlessly accept these talking points that are void of biblical principles, biblical truth, and that are supporting essentially really demonic and disgusting ideas, they are participating with modern Israel in their crimes, their oppression, and their injustice. Exodus 23, 1-2 reminds us. It tells us to never give false reports, to not join hands with wicked men, and therefore being a malicious witness. It tells us not to fall in with those who do evil. And I'm afraid that's exactly what these people have been doing for the last 2 years and perhaps for decades. True Christians do not pervert justice, they pursue it. And we've been called by God to love Him with our minds. So if you claim Christ and you've been guilty of using some of these excuses, I want you to consider something. The Bible tells us that the Spirit of the Lord leads us into all truth. And we also know that God knows end from beginning. He knows all things, all of time He knows. So He knew on October 6th what the reality would become today. A genocide in Gaza. Would the Spirit really lead you to support something that He knew would turn out like this, where civilians are collectively punished, where starvation is used as a weapon of war, where over 20,000 children have been murdered and innocent civilians have been targeted, where innocent blood has been spilled? The answer is no. He would not, and He did not, because that would bring shame to His name, and we know how He feels about the glory of His name. So that begs the question that I pray you will ask yourself. What or who is really shaping your life and your worldview? But thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful or you think somebody in your life might find it helpful, I hope you would share it with them. But thank you for being here, and I will see you next time.